up, rise up, rise up. They say it's to protect you, while they try to dispossess you of the right to decide between wrong or right, to openly discuss what politicians hide. They want to keep their secret plans from the public eye. We gotta keep our fires burning, keep our spirits bright. We gotta rise up, rise up, rise up. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people. Money got no children, and bombs ain't for building, and killing ain't no way to make a peaceful day, as all of God's children can easily explain. We gotta keep our fires burning, keep our spirits bright, stand up and speak for what we know is right. We gotta rise up, rise up, rise up. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people. I see days ahead. Kiss my children into bed. All across the planet I see that everything is fine. Yeah! Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people. We got the power and the will, and we'll do it for our children, for the warmongers and the corporate whores in the history books with the dinosaurs. I claim my power, I claim my rights, and no dirty tricks are gonna change my mind. I'm gonna rise up, rise up, rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up, rise up. Rise up, people, against the war. 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 Rise up.
Hello, this is Dan with Veterans for Peace Forum. Today's program is live with Navy veteran Laura Sandow on the issue of Guantanamo. A couple of things before we get going. I wanted to, I was sitting down trying to, think about how to approach this program, because I think it's a critically important program to think about the way our government responded to 9/11 and how it responded to what we call terrorism in the world, and picking up people off the field and putting them in Guantanamo. It was interesting because I was watching a few movies this morning, and I just kind of wanted to, I wrote something down just before coming here, and I'm just going to read this to you. The world can be a place of great beauty, and as children, many of us lived in that world, sheltered from the reality of the world of suffering. Gradually, we aged and we began to see the contradictions of what we were taught to believe in, that America/USA, because sometimes using America is a bit arrogant, because we've got North America, South America, Latin America, all of these Americas. But what we believed in our country was that it stood for, liberty, freedom, and equality for all. But it's not that simple. The illusion, though shattered by growing up in the world of racism, colonial vestiges, now a more economic empire than by nations, war, disease, domestic violence, domestic and international violence, wars, which produce crimes against humanity, Our beliefs were shattered. Yes, but the idea, the desire to live with that thing that we grew up with, to live in peace and harmony with liberty and justice for all, is something that we shouldn't give up just because a lot of things have been shattered, that illusion has been shattered. One of the reasons I, was a part of the military was at 19 years old, misguided, I would say, in believing certain things. Although I still had questions. I was in doubt at that time. But once entering the military, once entering the battlefield, one becomes, aware, shocked by its total reality. And you wonder, how are we going to make these things change? Well, one is you have to speak the truth. We have to get up and talk about these things. We can't be silenced for fear that others might think that we're against the U.S. We're not against the U.S. We are probably, I would say, people who believe in that idea that we grew up with as children, that we want to see that succeed. And to do that, we have to question the way we operate in the world. It was funny because this morning I was watching a movie called Path of Glory. It was a 1957 movie with Kirk Douglas, a World War II, World War I French colonial defender in this. He was defending 3 soldiers who were brought up for treason, mainly for cowardice. For their company was supposed to attack this hill that was under machine gun fire. Everyone was killed, and these 3 people, one who had fallen down and was buried under bodies of other people, was unconscious during that period of time. Another who may or may not have been a coward but retreated. Another one who had extinguished himself many times in the past in battle, but everyone was dead. It just made no sense that 3 men were going to run up against there. But it was all a ruse by the generals because of a colonel, a general, who had ordered firing on his own people in the area, and they call it the battery commander, refused to do that, and he kept ordering that. And so many men died in this, and yet to cover up that blunder, they needed 3 people. So out of this company, people that did survive, they had to pick 3 people by lottery to be executed for cowardice, and because they didn't win the hill. And for me, that deals with a lot of things that we're dealing with a case that happened with Brandon Mayfield, a case, the Dreyfus affair. There's so many different stories that happened. Bradley Manning, all of these people who, in our current time, right now, when I say the Dreyfus affair, that was back in the same period of time that we were talking about here in World War I, II, another case. The other movie I watched, which was interesting, was one of the things that the general said that I thought was kind of important to say. As the general would say, one way to maintain discipline of the troops is to shoot a man every now and then. This is the mentality of the people at that time. Another one was called The Quiet Man, and I've seen 2 versions of this. This was an earlier version. It was a Graham Greene novel. It was based on that. It's a private U.S. citizen who shows up in 1950 Vietnam. And you never hear his name. He's just the American, And he had what they called the third way. A third way. He believed that, between the communists and the French colonialists, there might be another way. Well, we know what that ended up being. But at that time, when they're talking about it, and Audie Murphy was the guy that I grew up watching all the war movies with as a kid, a World War II hero, in a sense, a person who had fought many wars and extinguished himself many times. But at the same time, those movies left me with an impression. There was always something about the movies he played in that I always questioned a little bit about why we were involved in these wars, the inhumanity and the horror of war at each time. And so this movie, in the same way, was a bit of a propaganda movie. It was a British journalist that he had met, and he began. He fell in love with the Brit's girlfriend, basically, and it was a whole story about that. But he was involved in meeting with people that made him look like he was CIA's spy, although it's never really found out whether he was or was not, or just a private citizen. But the whole thing is that the whole idea is that this journalist was duped by the communists, who set up his friend, not his competitor, for his girlfriend, to be assassinated by a communist cell. So in war, it doesn't matter what side you're on. War is horrible. People get killed. People are assassinated. People are tortured. All of these things begin to be something that we have to take into account. And then I watched here a couple of days ago an interview on Democracy Now! With the producer of a movie called The Act of Killing. I hope people out there saw this. This is about Indonesia and the genocide that took place. Amy Goodman was actually a reporter at the time and was shielded from being killed herself at one of these massacres that took place there by Alan Anir of Pacifica Radio. And but this movie, what was the strangest thing about it, as I was starting to watch it, was that this director began talking to the very perpetrators who are still alive, who are still in relative places of power, retired in some cases, who he began talking to them, and they began telling him the story of how they did it. They began telling the story of the massacres, and there's a sense of, I don't know, it's a bizarre sort of view that I've never seen before, and that is by it's like talking to a Nazi, telling you how you ran a concentration camp. But here's this guy walking free and dancing, singing, and then showing how he would wrap a wire around a pole so he wouldn't get blood all over him, and strung with this wire as he had it around this guy's neck, and kill him. These are not just stories, but they brought other people into it. And one of the guys actually said, if they show this film, we're going to look pretty bad, because we were saying the communists were the ones that were the cruel people. Again, communists are always there's some other. It's always the communists or the Muslims or somebody else that you have to have as your enemy. And in this case, he said, I think that we have to be really concerned about how we're going to be viewed. And the younger people would say, well, it's the truth. We need to tell. And when Amy Goodman says, why would they allow this? He said, because many of them still believe that they needed to instill fear in people. And that, to them, meant, yes, we did this, and if you defy us, we'll do it again. Very extreme. And that film is actually going to be playing here in Portland. We've got it up on the screen there for you. The Act of Killing, screening August 16th to the 22nd at Cinema 21. The address is up there, 616 Northwest 21st in Portland, Oregon. For more information, call the number on the screen. So here's an opportunity, and I want all of my friends, I think it'd be great to go to that film, and afterwards we can go out and have a beer and have a discussion. I think it's a good thing to do. So with all that, I'm watching Al Jazeera News. We hear about Egypt and hundreds, being killed, up to thousands saying being injured, says the Muslim Brotherhood. Libya, thousands escaped from prison. They said there was a bombing that took place in Somalia at a Turkish embassy. There was in Mali, there's a tense election just beginning to happen, and they worry about violence. We hear this news constantly. How do we keep the image of a better world out there? Well, we keep that image by questioning our present, questioning our past, in finding out the truth. And one of the things we have to talk about is about Guantanamo. And that's why we have Laura here. Laura was a Navy vet, and I've got to look at my notes here. She, a U.S. Navy veteran, was serving in Guantanamo Naval Base when the first detainees were brought there from the Middle East and Asia in 2001-2002. Her story is featured in a comic strip from the June 2013 issue of Symbolia. Is that how you say it? Symbolia? A new electronic magazine designed for tablets, okay. And this is basically the beginning of that story. If you can capture that at all. There, it takes them a little while. There we go. If you can see that. Well, you can get that online. Laura, you want to tell them where they can get that online?
Absolutely. You can find this on symboliamag.com. Excuse me. This was a wonderful project that I collaborated with Sarah Merck and Lucy Bellwood, who did the wonderful artwork. It was a labor of love. I am honored to have worked with such talented people to put this together. And it has given me the drive to do more activism, to prevent things like Guantanamo from happening in the future and to try to close Guantanamo now.
Okay, so let's get to know you a little bit here.
Okay.
So you're a Navy vet. And when we were talking earlier, you said that that you had lived in Dubai. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about Dubai and how you ended up in the military?
Certainly. I was married to a Jordanian citizen whose family lived in Dubai, and shortly after we were married, we moved to Dubai, and I held a couple of jobs there. First job was a sales job, and I got to meet a lot of people and develop a marketing plan for a small company that was starting, and it was a challenge, and it was interesting, and I got to meet a lot of people from different parts of the world. From there, I served with the American Business Council of Dubai and the Northern Emirates, and that's a department of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to help promote business between the U.S. and Dubai, and also other Gulf members, the Gulf states. I learned a lot about the culture, a lot about Islam. I found it a very fulfilling experience, a very enlightening experience. Unfortunately, my marriage didn't work out. My husband was abusive and controlling, and I needed to leave the situation. I turned to the Navy because I thought I could get some training and some experience and possibly work within the system to make some changes.
You said you were interested in oceanography?
Well, I was trained to be a meteorology and oceanography technician. So the first part of my time in the Navy was that training. That was also during 9/11, when I was training to be an oceanography and meteorology tech. From there, I went to Guantanamo Bay, and I was assigned to base operations as a meteorology and oceanography tech. Basically, we did ship routing, plane routing, watercraft, small watercraft safety, encoding and decoding environmental data, that kind of thing. From there, I served as an administrative assistant to the officer in charge for a little while. And from there, I moved to Norfolk and happily left Guantanamo. But my experience in Guantanamo was so different because I did have that experience of living in the Middle East first. To be immersed in the culture and to get to know the people and to get to know Islam, and then be in a situation where I felt, even though I was not guarding the prisoners, right. I felt like I was a part of something that I disagreed with.
Well, let's go back even a little further then. Okay, so where'd you grow up?
Well, I've lived a lot of places. I've lived all over. That's a hard question to answer.
Well, if you're, were you brought up in a Christian family, that kind of thing?
No, I'm very spiritual, but I am not religious.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not an expert on religion, but I have learned a lot about Christianity. Thank you. I'm not nervous. Islam and Judaism. So this has been a very interesting experience. I think this is a lot of where the propaganda for this war is coming from too, is this religious division. I felt like singling Muslims out for this type of thing was just an unbelievable thing in the first place. As far as I know, every single detainee was Muslim, and not, a lot of them. It was well known that a lot of them were picked up, possibly because of money, rewards for turning people in.
Right, bounties on
bounties,
people.
exactly.
Right.
People being in the wrong place at the wrong time, who maybe had really good intentions. I feel like they have been put, that blame of 9/11, they put it on them, and you cannot group together a group of people just because of this dislike for or ignorance of another culture.
Well, I think that's one of the major problems with many people in countries, not just here but around the world, is that there's a sort of Western view of the world and there's an Islamic view of the world. And they were two major cultures. Not that they're in conflict, but that they come together at various times in history. But we often don't know or understand those differences. There's a great book I read. A colleague of mine, a former colleague where I work, actually told me about this book called Destiny Disrupted: The History of the World Through Islamic Eyes, by Tamin Ansari. And this is the book. I found it really, really interesting to read because I began to follow a whole history that looked at the world in a different way. And they had codes of justice. They had senses of democracy. The whole idea of democracy, a whole idea of justice and mercy, and even protecting the enemy that came into your home. These were ideas that we're sitting there talking about now, about these people who seem to have through the biased eyes are cruel, have no sense of justice, who envy us because of our liberties, but who had opened up and throughout history actually freedom of religion for other people to live in their country and practice their religion. There's many great understandings, and like you, I was raised Catholic growing up. During my military time, I was having little problems with the idea of religion anyhow. Well, probably from high school on, I was having problems. When I came back, I was looking for something, and I didn't know I was going through post-traumatic stress and a lot of other things, but I was looking for something that made sense, and nothing seemed to make sense to me anymore. So I looked at, other Christian religions, and I practiced for a little bit, and I found good people, but hypocrisies that under the institution of those religions that I couldn't live with. And of course, I told you earlier that I lost a son. During that period of time, I was actually looking at Judaism, and I eventually converted to Judaism. But I was Reformed Judaism, and I began looking at things through a whole nother perspective. Again, I was turned around and seeing something in another perspective. And as an artist, I know that perspective, there's two-dimensional perspective, and if you're a sculptor, you see things in the round, and above you and below you, and space. You begin to see things in a whole different world, whether you're looking out or looking in. And all of these things began to, the different philosophies began to challenge my mind to think in different ways. I started looking, I looked at Hinduism and Taoism and all these other things. I felt most comfortable under this philosophy of Judaism. Religion itself, after I got past the point of, all religions should be teaching the same thing, and that was, that we're human beings and that we share the world together, and we've got to find a way to get along and to love one another. Once I got that, I didn't need organized religion anymore, I get it, we're human beings, and that's what we have to do. But I still, I still tip my hat, because that's where it really sunk into me. But I also learned the perspective of looking at things through other eyes. So Islam became something I had to study, a little bit of it. I know very little, but three of my colleagues at Portland State, one of my colleagues at Portland State and his two brothers, who are from Somalia. Abdi Hassan taught a class in racism, and I became his TA. And I learned a lot about Somalia, about the wars that were going on there, and about Islam and Africa and many other countries of the world. That Islam wasn't just one place in Saudi Arabia, it was all over the world. And you begin to see, that these different things open your eyes to a world out there. I also learned language, I started studying Spanish, and my father was born in Panama, so I have this real connection to Latin America. My wife is Chicana, and when I think of it, and I never learned Spanish well, but as I'm learning the language, I also learned the beauty of language, and that people have a different way of expressing what justice is, a different way of expressing what love is, poetry, etc. And it was interesting. At college, I had through the Black Studies program, brought in a author from Africa, Thiango. I can't remember, James Thiango, I believe his name was, who wrote a book. I think it was called Wretched of the Earth. And but when he was talking about the book, he was talking about that in his country he was put under, they had a warrant basically out for his arrest. And when they arrested him, they actually thought the protagonist in his book was real, and they went after that person. And then they arrested the book, he said. So when when he was in country, they arrested him, he went to jail. And he had been gone to college at Oxford, and had British law and all that in his head, and the language, that's the language that he spoke. When he's in prison, his own countrymen were speaking their own African language, and when he tried to defend himself, he said he began to realize that he was defending himself in the language of his oppressor, and that his people had different languages for justice and different ideas of mercy and how this should proceed. And he began to learn that again, that's that perspective of how we look at the world. And so we see how we respond to these things in the world. I think that once people can open their minds a little bit, it's hard to point your guns in the direction of people that have opened your mind in one sense or another. And they, vice versa, we're sharing ideas and views and stuff. Why do we have to impose upon other people at the point of the gun my view of how the world should run? Can't we share these things? So when these wars happen, they began to pick up, like you said, people, there would be bounties on people. You pick them up in the field, whether it was in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq. And one of the things we should talk about too is that we're going to have a program on this. You want to tell them a little bit what the program is going to be here?
Yes, I've worked hard to plan an event called The Grotesque Injustice of Guantanamo. This is an insider's account, insiders being me and Stephen T. Wax, who is a public defender who has defended several of the detainees in Gitmo, and is also a specialist on habeas corpus. I'm very honored to be working with him, and my co-host S. Brian Wilson. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a very good show. We are also bringing in via teleconference Andy Worthington, who has been an expert on Guantanamo for the last 7 years. He's been following Guantanamo, and I find that his work has been very consistent, and he works extremely hard to keep us up to date. I can't wait for his book to come out about the detainees. He has access to what each detainee was charged with or not charged with, their mental state when they were released, those sorts of bio things, and he is going to publish that and put it out to the world. So we're excited to have him joining us. Also, Medea Benjamin, a very well-known peace activist. We are honored to have her join us as well. Love to have somebody with a lot of energy, and she just certainly has that. She has written a lot of good essays. Her latest book on drones kind of spoke to me, but her general philosophy about Guantanamo and some of her passions about the state of the world are in line with my thinking as well, and so that I thought that it would be a good fit. John Hickman is the author of Selling Guantanamo.
I'll hold it up for you.
Okay. He just published this. It came out in May of this year. His take is that basically the neoconservatives are telling the world we're going to ignore international law, that we are going to do whatever we want as the U.S., from the U.S. standpoint. This is not acceptable. President Bush and his administration broke international law, and now I feel that we need to possibly do something above and beyond the law to get together and, you know, come up with a solution other than keeping people in indefinite prisons.
Yeah, and talking about the law, Stephen Wax, of course, is also the chief federal public defender for the District of Oregon and is considered one of the premier defenders in the nation with expertise in habeas corpus. He oversaw the legal team representing a number of kidnapped Guantanamo prisoners, including Sudanese hospital administrator Adel Ahmad, and successfully defended the Portland lawyer Brandon Mayfield, who most Portlanders know, who was arrested in the U.S. global war on terror and as a material witness to the bombing in Spain based on the FBI's grossly mistaken fingerprint identification. Now, he's also a graduate of Harvard Law School and a former law instructor at Lewis and Clark College. He is author of a book called Kafka Comes to America, Fighting for Justice in the War on Terror. It's 2008 publication. This is the book. And again, I just started reading this book. I'm up to about 90 pages now. And I am blown away by this book. Just learning and understanding of what's going on. I was amazed. I mean, if you just read a few things, even the quotes that he has in here. For one, in the very beginning, I should read, "Our government is a potent, omnipresent teacher. For good or evil, it teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for the law." Justice Louis Brandeis. And when you know, this is the thing that I've written many times to our politicians, to some judges, especially when they're prisoners who are political prisoners, to talk about that very thing. I said, how do you expect people to believe in the law when the law is culpable in these people committing crimes against humanity? It's hard. You can't do it. The law has no respect. And right now, I find that I'm having a very difficult time believing that we can get justice out of this country after we just saw the trial of Trayvon Martin. Again, that question has come up. There's a new book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander that talks about how the corruption of our judicial system. we have to look at how we can do that. But there's something positive too. You have people like Stephen Wax fighting for the rule of law, that all people fall under, and that we look for just laws, and that we look for mercy, and we look for understanding. And we have to kind of take a look at, well, Brandon Mayfield. He's defending Brandon Mayfield. Right. FBI has 100% proof he was involved in the bombing because of the fingerprint. Well, but they, as I'm reading it, they have 100% proof, but the Spanish government didn't quite believe that it was Brandon's fingerprint. But they agreed, okay, you guys, they did an extra test. Well, that extra test, a third level test apparently, in fingerprinting was under debate among fingerprinters throughout the world. And then it turns out they had somebody else that had those fingerprints. And it's just, this move or action because of 9/11. Really, you can understand people's fear and anger and wanting to punish people for a crime of terrorism, basically, a crime against innocent civilians in a building. But at the same time, you want to get the right people. You want to see that people, how do you do that? You have to have evidence, right?
Well, I think you're right. But putting people away and not giving them trials is not the way to do it.
That's exactly what I'm talking. To get that evidence, you have to give a person an opportunity to go to trial.
Well, I think the bigger picture here is that this is kind of a reflection of the decay of our justice system.
Mm-hmm.
This is really something that people should look at, not just in the U.S.
That's right.
But all around the world. And that's part of what I had in mind when I was pulling these people together. I thought we have to look at alternative ways to make things happen. And this may just be a beginning. It may just be an event, but I really hope that it will be something that instigates some change in the future and new platforms for people solving problems.
Well, we have the Guantanamo prisoners on a hunger strike.
Right.
And when we began to talk about that, I think the last thing I read was there were, how many prisoners were there? There was 166 detainees from more than 25 Middle East Asian countries. I probably don't have all my notes here for that. Do you know?
My latest is that it's 170.
170?
At least at this point, yeah.
And there were so many that were in the hospital being force-fed?
I know of at least 3 that have been hospitalized.
Yeah. And that when we start talking about that, when we talk about force-feeding, this is also the beginning of Ramadan.
Right, correct.
And Ramadan means, the people are fasting from dawn to dusk, and that it's again a religious belief, and if anything in prison you would at least allow people to have the sanctity of their own religion and their belief, but then being force-fed if they decided to continue. This is and many of the human rights organizations are calling this torture. And many doctors are saying that too. One of the other things is that, I don't find these things unusual. In the 1980s, Brian Wilson, a former commander in security unit in Vietnam, trained as a lawyer and a criminologist, a long-time peace activist, well known here in Portland and throughout the world. He also joined a hunger strike with veterans and other people. Diane Wilson, I think of Code Pink, and more and more people are getting involved in that in solidarity with the Guantanamo hunger strike. It's reminiscent of the Irish hunger strike back in the 70s, I believe it was. But one of the things that I think is important is that there's a real commitment by Brian and by so many other people. Brian was in an auto accident and his doctor took him off the hunger strike, but he's out there vigiling still. out there showing up in front of the courthouse, I think Monday through Friday,
Yep.
from 2 o'clock to
I think it's 4 to 6 now.
4 to 6 now. And with others, and they're holding up a banner to let people know that this is a movement that's growing throughout the country. There's another friend of mine, Elliot Adams, who was a former president of Veterans for Peace, who's been on a hunger strike for some 300 days now, and he just takes a handful of oats every morning, and that's about it, and continuing the fast. And I mean, these are people that are so committed because they see that this is a total injustice. Because if we're talking about many of those prisoners,
Right.
they have actually been exonerated and are ready to be released. Isn't that correct?
Exactly. A lot of them have been, and it's basically what we hear is that the president is tied up with red tape in the Congress, and I just think that that's not an excuse. I think we can do better than that. But yes, a lot of them have been cleared for release. And that's the saddest part. We were keeping people for years on end. Some people have been cleared for release since 2007, maybe even 2006. Some people, and it's that's just not scares me. And really, part of the reason why I wanted to speak out too. I think it's just such a wrong way to be a beacon of human rights as the U.S. is supposed to be. This is not a good example. Obviously, I'm passionate about it.
Yes. And when you were in Guantanamo, did you see prisoners yourself, or?
Well, I did not see prisoners myself. I was there when they first started sending detainees down there. So I saw it go from this very sleepy, dilapidated base to triple the size it was when I first got there. So that was probably 2,000 people to about 7,000 people when I left. You can imagine on a base that size what a difference that makes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the base, what it looks like?
Well, I'm sharing this part with you because it kind of helps me lead into the next part. There was one main street down this dilapidated base, and I didn't see prisoners per se, but as I've shared in my comic, they had no better option when they first started sending prisoners to Camp X-Ray than to send them down the main street of the base. And what that meant basically was that they sent them in blacked out buses, and people were patrolling with M16s. The exchange, which is on the main drag, of course. That was my experience, being shopping and in my routine and stepping out and thinking it was a drill at first, but realizing that there was somebody pointing an M16 at me and there was a blacked out bus going by, and I knew exactly what was going on. Now, Camp X-Ray was not well hidden. You wouldn't normally see it, on your daily schedule, but I did have a car. I also had a lot of curiosity, and I did find ways to kind of peer into Camp X-Ray and see what it looked like. And it was a very shabbily put together cage of razor wire, and they had these bright lights on all the time, and it was eerie. I hope someday I can paint a picture or.
Well, some things, the image I get is,
Yeah.
and I don't know where I get that from, but is almost like a dog run, and you have people in these cages, that so many feet by so many feet, but it's all open. There's no walls or anything around it, so they're open to the elements.
Animals, yeah.
Yeah, is that true?
That's true. They had basically aluminum metal
roofing,
which was fine when they first were sent down there because it was January, February. As the temperature gets warmer in Guantanamo, you can imagine how that's not very pleasant.
Right.
So that in itself was torture.
Right.
You know, and yeah, it was very open. It was not. I know part of the Geneva Convention, you know, states that, you know, people should not be put on display if they're prisoners of war. I feel like this really was a situation where they put people on display, not necessarily meaning to, but it was not. It wasn't a well-hidden secret either. You know, it was.
Well, when you use the term prisoners of war, in fact, the government doesn't use the term
No, I know.
prisoners of war.
Detainees, excuse me.
And because we're not at war with any particular country, we're on war with an idea, terrorist cells that are everywhere in the world. This is one of the problems that we're dealing with. In fact, Stephen Wax talks about the Bush administration looking at ways they could get around the Geneva Convention. Rules of war, and not just rules of war, but just sort of a morality that people had come to around the world, how prisoners should be treated, right?
Right.
And I think I have it right here. He said that our country, if I can find it, let's see, that George Washington actually, in the beginning of this country, when the Brits had taken prisoners of his troops and had wiped them out and tortured them, he came to the conclusion that we were not going to do that, that this country was going to treat people as human beings. And that was sort of the foundation of how we began thinking about prisoners in of war here in the United States. I can't find it right now, but the so I mean, this is something the Geneva Convention talks about. The idea that they had to change these men in the battlefield. If they, not all of them were picked up in the battlefield, they were taken from their homes, places they lived. Even here in Portland, people who were Muslims and picked up, there was a great fear here in Portland because of some cases that people may actually have been involved in joining a movement outside of this country, but at the same time there were people here that they belonged to a mosque, or they knew somebody, or were part of a charity organization that had an Islamic name. All these things created fear. I remember at Portland State, and I went back when I was in my 40s, so I was there, you know, just only 10, 15 years ago, and they had Somali students and Palestinian students and other Islamic students who were actually being questioned and followed, and it created a fear within the community and how we looked at them. And that basis of fear is a basis of bias and racism and profiling people. So profiling is a form of racism. I understand people's fear, but we have to have, I'm more afraid of losing our liberties and our respect for one another than I am of somebody attacking me. I've been robbed before. My house has been burglarized. I don't worry about that happening to me every single day of my life. I don't live being afraid, you know. I don't want to live being afraid. I want to live in a world where I think that we have decent, wonderful, respectful human beings in this world. And many of the people in our community of all religions have come out in support of trying to close down Guantanamo. If we give a little bit, do you know the history of Guantanamo?
I do.
Okay,
yes.
Could you tell us how it even began?
Certainly, I can give you maybe a brief rundown. I'm not an expert, but it was actually found by Christopher Columbus in 1494, I believe. He landed in a town near Guantanamo, called Baracoa, I believe. I would someday like to see that very much. Yeah. He was the original, that was the original establishment there. with the War of the Spanish, the Americans sent troops down there, and by 1903, I believe, we had signed a lease to rent this property on the southeast edge of Guantanamo, or of Cuba, and to use it for a base and a coaling station. It's had its ups and downs. There was a period in time where Castro cut off the water. We had to come up with a desalination plant to make sure we had a clean water source. And it's been home to many Haitian refugees in the past. So it was kind of ready to go to set up a camp in its own way. And I wonder how much of that was planned in the future and part of the decision.
Well, it's also been, the Cuban Revolution
Right.
we created an independent country, but the U.S. held on to that piece of property before it was being rented from the previous governments. They held on to it. They didn't have much choice, but at the same time, they were paying rent to. Who was the former? I can't remember the name now. Before Castro.
I don't remember.
Oh, I do know it. I just can't remember right now. Brain freeze. But at the same time, when they did that, when the revolution came, one payment was paid to the revolutionary government, the Cuban government, and then Fidel said no more. And they have refused to take any of those checks from then on.
That's correct.
So, we are stubbornly there at basically still at the point of the gun, still looking for an avenue to overthrow the revolution in that country. It's really a middle finger to the Cuban Revolution, I would say, and to the people. And if we look at the history of all the Caribbean, the slave trades, the plantations. When those things were closed down, the corporations wanted to maintain power, angry that they had lost their revenue from cheap labor or slave labor, and continually are demanding reparations from the government of Cuba and in other places throughout the world. A great book, In These Veins in Latin America by, God, I'm bad today. I know all these people, and I'm sorry about that. But when we talk about the history of Latin America, the history of slavery, the history of exploitation of people, we're also asking them to pay for reparations for their own slavery, for us taking their resources and stopping them from stealing from the people. They demand that these governments be overthrown and taken out. So now we're dealing. Just recently I had a speaker here that was talking about Mossadegh and and Iran and the coup that took place there by the CIA. Same people that were involved in these things from the Dulles brothers on. In Latin America and Hawaii and Iran, the Middle East, you name it. These were sort of colonial powers, or in our estimation, we were liberating the people. And didn't we hear that from Bush in the beginning?
Oh, I believe we did.
We are there to liberate them. And I've actually heard a lot of veterans that have joined the military said that they went there because they believed that they were liberating the people of that country from oppressive dictators.
Well, that's one thing I've found with most people I've met in the military, outside the military, especially in Veterans for Peace and the Viking vets at Portland State University. People who really wanted to make a difference in the world. I was one of those people who thought by gaining rank in the system I could make a difference. Once I learned how messed up the system was, I decided instead of pursuing a career in global business and public policy, to do something more artistic and utilize my resources to do art and social practice and combine those things. I think I have more flexibility that way. But that's what it takes, is kind of thinking outside of the norm and doing some things that differently.
I agree. I mean, this is what is a great opportunity for people here. You're hearing this is just a taste of listening to Laura's story, and more you can find out by going online to read the comic book. But again, show up to our event that's coming up on The Grotesque Injustice of Guantanamo, an insider's account, a presentation of the illegality, immorality, and inhumanity of the U.S. Naval Detention Center at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Now, this is going to be August 1st, and it's brought to you by Veterans for Peace, and we have about 18 co-sponsors. I think other people also are out there sponsoring it, because I know they just got in late before we published this.
Right.
KBOO radio station. We have to listen to those alternative news agencies too. Support cable radio, KBOO radio. Support Metro East Community Media. We need cable access that makes programs like this available to people throughout our community. We also try to get this up on YouTube as soon as we can. So that we can, a lot of people aren't sitting around on a Saturday evening, a nice sunny day. They're out barbecuing or having something, visiting their friends, or like my wife, who's taking care of my granddaughter right now. If we can put it now, our technology allows us to put it up on YouTube, so you can see that. We also have the announcements on Facebook, so you can just go, you can Google in The Grotesque Injustice of Guantanamo, and you will get a Facebook page on that. You'll see some conversations and some more information. And actually, I posted a WikiLeaks history of Guantanamo, which is, you can do that yourself. Go to WikiLeaks, look that up, that history, and you'll find out more about what's going on there. I went to Cuba in I think it was 1994, I believe. While I was at Portland State, I'd taken some time off and went there, and I found wonderful people and a whole different world. We got to wrap up here. I'm sorry that this program is going by so fast, and we never get a chance to say it all, but I want to thank you, Laura.
Well, thank you, Dan.
For coming on the program. People, please get out there, get involved, join Veterans for Peace if you're a veteran or not a veteran. I want to thank my producers, Jim Lockhart and Kelly Labonte, and Metro East Community TV for putting this program on for us. We're here every 4 Saturdays. Thank you.